She was 22 and a blacksmith's apprentice, and she had been given until the end of October to get off the land that had been her home for 6 years. In the autumn of 1887, with her master 3 weeks in the ground and no legal claim to anything inside his forge, Hazel Voss— no, wait. Let me start over without that slip. Let me find the right name and begin properly. She was 22 and a blacksmith's apprentice, and she had nowhere left to go when the frost came to the Ottawa Valley. We should tell you about Maren Dray before we tell you what she found, because the finding doesn't mean anything without the before. Without the 6 years she spent learning iron at the side of a man who believed that honest work was the most honest prayer a person could offer. Settle in, wherever you are tonight, and let us tell you her story. Maren Dray had not been born to the forge. She had been born to difficulty, which is perhaps the same thing. She was the daughter of a Quebecois mother who died of fever when Maren was 4, and a Scottish-Irish father who drank his grief down steadily over the following years until it consumed him entirely. By the time she was 16, she had already learned to be small and quiet in the way that children learn when smallness and quietness are the only armor available. She had also learned, from watching, from necessity, from a stubborn streak that seemed to be the one thing her father had given her worth keeping, how to fix things. A loose wagon wheel, a warped door hinge, a cracked axle pin on a neighbor's plow. Her hands knew their way around metal long before she understood why. It was a broken wagon spring that changed her life. She had dragged it 3 miles to the forge at the edge of Dunmore, the small Ontario settlement where her father had landed them in one of his more optimistic moments. And she had watched through the open door as the blacksmith worked. His name was Robert Colm. He was a big, quiet man in his late 50s, a widower with no children, whose forge was the tidiest building in the county. He watched her watch him for a long time before he said anything. "You're not looking at the iron," he said. "You're looking at the joining. The weld is what holds," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she would come to know well over the years. A kind of careful attention, as if he were assessing the grain of a piece of metal before committing to shaping it. He fixed the spring, he charged her nothing, and 3 days later he appeared at the door of the shack she shared with her father and offered her an apprenticeship. Her father barely stirred from his chair to acknowledge the conversation. Robert Colm taught her everything. He taught her the color of iron at the right temperature, the dull red that meant patience, the orange that meant now, the yellow-white that meant hurry. He taught her how to read the grain of a piece of steel, the way a careful reader moves through a difficult page, slowly and with attention. He taught her the particular pride of a clean weld, of a hinge that would swing true for 30 years, of a tool balanced so perfectly in the hand that using it felt like an extension of thought rather than an act of effort. He taught her, too, the subtler things. How to price her work fairly, how to deal with men who assumed she couldn't do it, how to hold her ground without raising her voice. "The forge doesn't care who you are," he told her once, turning a piece of red glowing steel with a practiced ease that looked effortless and was not. "It only cares what you do." People could learn from that. She worked beside him for 6 years. She slept in the small room above the forge, ate at his table, and gradually, quietly, became someone. Not someone important in the way the county's merchants and landowners measured importance. She was still the drunk's daughter. Still a woman in a trade that lifted its eyebrows at women, but someone in the way that mattered more. She knew who she was. She knew what she could do. That knowledge had weight to it, like a good tool in the hand. Robert Colm died on the 7th of September, 1887, of a heart that had been wearing out slowly for years and finally finished the job. She held his hand at the end. He had no family to send for. What she did not know, what she could not have known until the lawyer arrived the following week with his brown leather case and his careful expressions, was that the forge, the land it stood on, the small house beside it, none of it had been left to her. Robert Colm had made a will some years earlier, before her time, leaving everything to a nephew. The nephew's name was Gerald Hasp, and he arrived from Hamilton 11 days after the funeral, driving a good horse and wearing a wool coat that had not come cheap. Gerald Hasp was not a cruel man in the way that dramatic men are cruel. He was something quieter and more deflating than that. He was simply indifferent. He looked at the forge, at the equipment, at the house, with the calculating eye of a man pricing assets for sale, and he looked at Maren Dray with a polite absence of recognition, as though she were a piece of furniture whose provenance he couldn't quite place. She explained that she had been Robert's apprentice for 6 years, that she was a trained blacksmith, that the forge had been her home and her livelihood. He nodded throughout this with the expression of a man waiting for a long sentence to end. "I'm selling the property," he said, when she was finished. "I've already had an offer from a man in Carleton who wants the equipment. I'll need the premises vacated by the end of the month." He handed her an envelope. Inside were $23, Robert's last month of earnings, which he apparently thought was generous, and a folded deed on a single yellowed sheet of paper. "There's also this," Gerald Hasp said, in the tone of a man conferring a mercy. "It appears my uncle owned a small parcel of land up on the Rideau escarpment. Completely wild, as far as I can tell. No structure, no road access to speak of. It's worth nothing to me. I've had it transferred to your name. You have something at any rate." She looked at the deed. The land was described as a quarter section on the north face of the escarpment, remote, rocky, bordered on two sides by crown timber. A wilderness lot, the kind of thing a man filed a claim on in hopeful years and forgot in harder ones. She did not beg. She had learned, in 6 years at the forge, that begging and iron have something in common. Heat changes both, and not usually for the better. She looked at Gerald Hasp steadily, and she thanked him in a voice that came from somewhere very still and very cold inside her. "I'll be gone by morning," she said. She went back to the forge, her forge in every way that mattered and none of the ways that were written down, and she packed what she could. Her apprentice's tools, a small cross-peen hammer, a pair of tongs, a cold chisel, a file set in a roll of canvas, her work apron, stiff with years of use, a change of clothes, a tin of hardtack and dried meat, a blanket, and last, from the nail by the forge door where it had hung for as long as she had worked there, she took Robert Colm's old striking hammer, the one he had used for heavy work, its handle worn smooth in the exact shape of his grip. It was the most honest thing he had ever owned. She wrapped it in her spare shirt and set it in the bottom of her pack. She left in the gray before dawn, not looking back at the building that had been the nearest thing to a home she had ever known. The road north out of Dunmore narrowed quickly into a track, and the track thinned into something closer to suggestion than pathway, as the land rose toward the escarpment. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the world was making its seasonal preparations with characteristic indifference to her situation. The maples had mostly gone bare, and their fallen leaves lay sodden and dark across the trail. The sky was the color of cold iron. Her breath came in small white clouds. She had 14 miles to walk to reach the land described on the deed, and she walked all of them before the light failed, arriving at the edge of the property in the last thin hour of dusk. There was nothing there. That was the first thing she understood. No structure, no clearing, just the close-pressed dark of second-growth pine and birch with the limestone face of the escarpment rising behind it. She might have wept if she had been someone who wept easily. Instead, she found a sheltered hollow at the base of a large rock outcropping, gathered enough dry material from the underside of fallen logs to start a fire, and spent the first night under open sky, watching the stars appear one by one through the branches overhead. She was not afraid. That surprised her. She thought she ought to be. 22 years old, alone, no shelter, the temperature already dipping toward freezing at night. But what she felt instead was a peculiar, stripped-down clarity. Everything unnecessary had been removed. What remained was just her and what she knew how to do. She rose at first light and started walking the perimeter of the property, and that was when she found the building. It was set back against the limestone face, so thoroughly swallowed by encroaching brush and the shadow of the cliff that it would have been invisible from the trail. A small structure, 8 feet wide and perhaps 20 long, built from squared timbers that had been cut and fitted with a precision she recognized immediately as the work of someone who had known exactly what they were doing. The corners were dovetailed, tight as the day they were set. The roof had partially collapsed where a tree had fallen across it some years before, but the walls were sound. The chimney, built from flat pieces of local limestone, stood intact. There was no door, the frame was open to the elements, and the interior was dark with years of leaf fall and animal passing. She walked around it slowly, the way Robert Colm had taught her to approach unfamiliar metalwork, looking first for the whole shape before examining the details. She took in the workmanship, the stone chimney's careful construction, the way the building had been positioned to use the cliff face as shelter from the north wind. This had not been built carelessly. This had been built by someone who intended it to last. It would need a new roof section, a door, and serious cleaning. But the bones, her father-in-law's phrase. No, Robert's phrase. The bones were true. Over the following days, she did what she knew how to do. She worked, water first. Following a seep of moisture along the cliff base, she found a spring 20 yards from the building. Cold and clear, running steadily from a crack in the limestone. She cleared the debris from around it and lined its small pool with flat stones to keep the mud down. Then fuel. The collapsed tree that had taken out part of the roof was already half dry and would split cleanly. She worked at it for an afternoon with the hatchet she had borrowed. Taken, if she was being exact, from the Dunmore Forge's tool wall in the last dark minutes before she left. Gerald Hasp could subtract it from her 6 years. She foraged carefully in those first days, in the way Robert had once described his own lean years when he was starting out. Methodically, without panic, looking for what was actually there, rather than mourning what wasn't. Late-season berries, shriveled but still good. Cattail roots at the edge of a small pond a quarter-mile down the slope. A rabbit that came too close to her fire one evening and made a poor decision. She was not well fed, but she was fed, and she was grateful to be competent enough to manage it. The forge was what she missed with a physical ache, the weight and structure of real work. But her hands did not forget how to be useful. She used her cold chisel and a rock to split shingles from a fallen cedar she found on the far edge of the property. She fitted them to the damaged section of roof, using pegs she carved from the hardest wood she could find, a method she had read about once in one of Robert's old books. The work kept her warm, and gave her something to direct the part of her mind that kept circling back to the forge, to Gerald Hasp's indifferent face, to the envelope of $23 that felt more like a closing argument than a gift. It was the 10th day when she found the cavity. She had been examining the chimney, planning how she might light the first fire, and she noticed what her trained eye almost passed over. A section of the stonework, just to the right of the firebox, where the mortar was a slightly different color. Not much. You would not see it unless you were looking at the stones the way she looked at metal, with the specific attention of someone who understood that inconsistency is always a message. She pressed her palm flat against the stones in question. Then she drew Robert's striking hammer from her pack and tapped each one in sequence, listening. Solid, 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 and then one. A hollow, resonant ring that was unmistakably not bedrock behind it. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she lit a pitch pine splinter in the small fire she'd built outside the building and began to work at the mortar with her cold chisel. It took most of the day. The mortar was old and hard, and she was working with tools designed for other purposes. But she was patient, and her arms were strong. By late afternoon, she had loosened 3 stones and created an opening large enough to reach into. What breathed out from the gap was cold and dry, the smell of paper and dust and something faintly metallic. She reached in carefully and her hand found the edge of a box. She extracted 4 items, a flat tin box about the size of a ledger, sealed with a rusted clasp, a small canvas roll tied with twine, a folded paper that appeared to be a letter, and a heavy object wrapped in oilskin that clinked when she moved it. She unwrapped the oilskin first. Inside were coins, not a fortune, nothing so theatrical. But there were several dozen of them, a mix of older Canadian silver and American gold pieces, and they had the weight of real consequence. She set them on the flat stone beside her and opened the tin box. Inside were papers, documents, in the careful script of the previous century. She could see at a glance that some of them were old enough to predate Confederation. There were land surveys, correspondence, and what appeared to be an account book. She lifted the account book carefully. The pages were brittle but intact. She turned to the first entry and began to read. The name that appeared in the first line, and then on the next page, and the one after that, was one she knew. Aldous Pye. She sat back on her heels and steadied herself against the limestone wall. Aldous Pye was the land agent for most of the upper Ottawa Valley. He was 60 years old, immensely wealthy, politically connected, and the man who had handled the legal transfer of Robert Colm's estate on behalf of Gerald Hasp. He had also, she now understood, handled a great many other things. The account book was a private record, meticulous, almost obsessively detailed, of payments made received in connection with land transactions going back to the 1860s. Timber lots filed under false names, survey boundaries adjusted by fractional degrees, enough to move a property line across someone's field or woodlot, fees paid to county officials, fees paid to judges, and then, several pages in, a series of entries that made her set the book down and breathe very carefully for a moment. A family named Stonebridge, settled on the escarpment property in 1871, listed as squatters, evicted after a legal challenge in 1873 on the grounds that their claim was improperly filed. Except, she turned the page, the original claim had been properly filed. The account book noted, in Aldous Pye's economical script, that the county record had been corrected in exchange for a specified sum. The property, following the Stonebridge eviction, had been absorbed into a timber lot. The timber lot, a year later, had generated a figure that she stared at for a long time before folding the book closed. She opened the letter next. It was dated 1874 and written in a different hand. Educated, careful, and frightened. The writer, who signed himself only as F.M., described himself as a land surveyor who had been asked by Aldous Pye to falsify a series of boundary measurements. He had done it, he wrote, out of fear of what refusal would cost him. He had kept one copy of the actual surveys, accurate ones, and hidden them here, at the building on the escarpment that Pye did not know he had access to. He wrote that he intended to bring the matter to a government official and had reason to believe Pye was aware of his intentions. If this letter is found by someone who is not Pye, he wrote, then I have either succeeded or failed by another means. The surveys in the canvas roll are the true record of the boundaries as I measured them. They contradict, in every case where I was asked to adjust them, the official county record. I pray they are used correctly. Maren sat for a long time in the thin autumn light, the papers in her lap, Robert Colm's striking hammer on the ground beside her. Aldous Pye, the man who had processed the deed that had sent her here. She was smart enough to understand her position. A young woman alone on a wilderness lot with documents that implicated one of the most powerful land agents in the Ottawa Valley had no standing to simply walk into the county courthouse and demand justice. She knew enough of how these things worked. She had heard enough in 6 years at the forge, where people talked freely around someone who appeared to be merely fixing things, to know that Pye's connections would swallow her whole. Before she finished her first sentence, she needed to think the way Robert had taught her to think about a difficult repair job. Find the piece that, if moved correctly, causes everything else to follow. She needed someone who understood the law and hated Aldous Pye. Those two qualities, she suspected, were not difficult to find in combination. The first person she thought of was a woman in the settlement of Grasmere, 8 miles east along the escarpment. A woman she had met once at a regional fair, who had been pointed out to her as someone whose family had lost land in a disputed survey. Her name was Charlotte Finlay, and she was a schoolteacher, which meant she was educated, and she was a schoolteacher in 1887, which meant she had learned to be formidable, or she hadn't lasted. Maren wrapped the papers back in oilskin, placed the coins in her canvas tool roll, alongside her chisels and her file set, and put everything in the bottom of her pack beneath her blanket. Then she spent 2 more days making the structure as secure as she could. She would not leave the documents there, but she wanted to know the place was real and hers before she left it for any length of time. She walked to Grasmere in a day and a half, arriving in the early evening. Charlotte Finlay answered her own door. A tall woman in her mid-40s, with reading spectacles pushed up into her gray-streaked hair and the particular expression of someone who was accustomed to assessing strangers quickly and accurately. She looked at Maren for a moment in silence. "You're the Colm girl," she said. "I heard Hasp turned you out." "I need to talk to you about Aldous Pye," Maren said. Charlotte Finlay opened the door wider. "Then you'd better come in." What happened in the weeks that followed was slower and quieter than a confrontation and more durable than revenge. Charlotte Finlay had spent 8 years trying to recover her family's lot in a timber dispute that Aldous Pye had managed to the benefit of his clients. She knew a retired county clerk in Pembroke who had grown old and honest and had his own reasons to dislike the land agent. She knew a journalist at the Ottawa Free Press who had been trying for 2 years to write a story about irregularities in the Valley's land registry and had been unable to locate a single document willing to go on record. He had one now. The process was careful and took nearly 2 months. Maren returned to the building on the escarpment and made it livable through the early part of November, packing insulation into the wall gaps with strips of cedar bark and moss, building up a supply of firewood, fitting a door from lumber she traded for with the last of the silver coins. Careful, small trades at different settlements so that no pattern was visible. Charlotte Finlay visited twice, staying overnight both times, bent over the account book with a lamp and a magnifying glass, working methodically through entries and cross-referencing them against land registry copies she had collected over years. The retired clerk from Pembroke, a man named Gordon Strauss, arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late November with a leather satchel full of his own documentation. He looked at the surveyor's account book, at the letter from FM, at Charlotte's cross-reference notes, and he sat very quietly for a long time. "I've known something was wrong since 1876, he said at last. "I didn't have the shape of it." He had the shape of it now. What Aldous Pye received in December of 1887 was not a public accusation. It was a private communication. One sheet of paper, delivered by hand to his office, that contained a single summary paragraph describing the contents of the hidden account book and the surveyor's correspondence, and noting that copies of the relevant documents were now held by the Ottawa Free Press, the Department of the Interior's Land Registry Office, and the law offices of a firm in Ottawa, whose name he would recognize because he had dealt with them professionally and not always honestly. The second sheet was a list of the affected properties and the families who had lost them. There was no demand attached. There didn't need to be. Aldous Pye's resignation from his agency was announced before Christmas, attributed to his health. The health story was true, in a way that no one discussed openly. He had understood, with a clarity that few experiences provide, what exposure would cost him in a country that was still building its sense of itself and had particular contempt for those who corrupted the founding agreements about land. He quietly reimbursed several families through intermediaries. Several land titles were quietly corrected through the registry process. Gordon Strauss helped facilitate. The Stonebridge heirs, two sisters now living in Toronto, received a formal acknowledgement of error in their family's claim. None of it was complete. These things are never complete, but the walls of the cage, as someone wise had once told Charlotte Finlay, were enough. Maren stayed on the escarpment. By spring, she had the building fully repaired and had begun to address the thing she had been calculating since her first week there: how to build a proper forge without a foundry and without capital. The answer was that she couldn't, not immediately, but she could begin. She traded skilled labor, door repairs, hinge work, tool maintenance, at settlements along the escarpment road, accepting payment partly in iron scrap and partly in food. She built a small clay and stone smelting hearth against the cliff face and used it through the winter to do light work, sharpening tools, repairing simple hardware. It was a fraction of what she was capable of. It was a beginning. By the following summer, she had enough iron, enough equipment, and enough of a local reputation to build a proper forge. Charlotte Finlay helped her file the legal claim on the property correctly, making sure nothing in the paperwork gave any future Aldous Pye an edge. Gordon Strauss, who had by then retired to a small place near Grasmere, came by twice a week to have his tools maintained and to talk, which Maren had found she valued more than she expected. People came, the way people come to a place that has become something. Not all at once, not with ceremony, but steadily. A family who had heard about the land restitution and had questions about their own claim. A woman from the next township who needed a place to stop on a long journey and stayed for a week and helped with the roof work and left knowing she had a friend somewhere she hadn't before. A young man who asked to learn the forge and turned out to have exactly the instinct for it that Robert Colm had once seen in a 16-year-old girl watching through an open door. She taught him the color of iron at the right temperature. She taught him to read the grain of steel, and she hung Robert Colm's striking hammer on a nail by the forge door, where it had always lived, and told him the same thing she had been told. The forge doesn't care who you are, it only cares what you do. Maren Dray had come to the escarpment with $23, a tool roll, and a deed to nothing. She had found, in that nothing, the evidence that brought down one of the valley's most powerful men, and returned land to families who had given up on ever seeing it. She had built something from the ground up with her own hands, in a place chosen for her by someone who meant it as an ending. It was not an ending. The coins from the hidden cash had been divided carefully, some used for the forge, the rest given to Charlotte Finlay to hold in trust for the families named in the account book. Maren had kept one. It sat on the ledge of the forge window, where the light caught it in the mornings. A small, plain reminder that what others consider worthless has a value that only becomes visible when someone with the right eyes takes the time to look. We like to think Robert Colm would have recognized that. We think he taught it to her, in the way that the best teachers do, not by naming it, but by showing her what careful attention looks like, day after day, until she couldn't see the world any other way. She was 22 when Gerald Hasp handed her that deed and looked through her like she wasn't there. She was 23 when the forge at the top of the escarpment lit its first proper fire and the smoke rose clean and straight into a spring sky. Those $23 were, as it turned out, the most generously useful money anyone in Dunmore had ever given away without intending to. We wonder sometimes about the thing that looks like a dead end. The unexpected inheritance, the unwanted property, the skill that doesn't seem to fit anywhere. What hidden foundation might be underneath it? waiting for someone who knows how to listen for the hollow sound. What has been handed to you that you haven't yet looked at closely enough?